Bonjour, good morning. I think that we will start so that we don't run late. Alors, je suis vraiment... c'est en fait un très très grand plaisir pour moi de... Et aussi, je devrais dire, c'est aussi un moment plein d'émotions pour moi de participer à cette conférence dans le cadre du 35e anniversaire de notre centre de recherche. Mes pensées vont bien sûr vers le docteur André Roquelecourt, le fondateur de notre centre, et je pense que s'il était parmi nous aujourd'hui, il serait extrêmement fier de l'œuvre accomplie par ses successeurs, le docteur Yves Joannette et la docteure Sylvie Belleville. Il serait également, je crois, très très fier de la place que ce centre a pris à l'échelle nationale et internationale. Une place chef de file, en fait, dans la recherche sur le vieillissement et le bien-vivre de nos aînés. Roquelecourt était un visionnaire. Et je pense qu'il serait tout de même assez surpris de voir ce que nous avons accompli et de voir aussi la diversité, en fait l'explosion des domaines de recherche qui font part de notre centre, la recherche qui est menée au centre. Et il en serait bien sûr ravi. Mais n'oublions pas que le tout a commencé par une préoccupation particulière, et c'était celle des troubles du langage, et plus particulièrement de l'aphasie. And today it is precisely about language that we will talk. We'll give you three presentations on language. And I'm switching to English now for our guests. So I'm giving you a short outline. The first talk, Words Across the Lifespan, will be presented by Dr. Gary Libben and myself. And this will be followed by a talk by our distinguished guest, Dr. Ruth Ann Atchley, who will talk about the strengths of event-related potentials in evaluating linguistic change across the lifespan. And finally, Dr. Nancy Azevedo will be talking about ERPs, in fact, and showing how what Dr. Atchley will present in terms of a very useful methodology, how this can be, in fact, applied very usefully to the study of Alzheimer's disease. So, since we're working within a framework of psycholinguistics, what is psycholinguistics? It is actually really the study of how people do language, and this will become much clearer what we mean by do language when Gary Libben will be talking in a little while. Language behavior is extraordinarily complex, in fact. Yet, in the absence of pathology, the acquisition and mastery of at least one language is a human universal, and we know that now people learn more than languages, and most people are in fact bilingual or multilingual. So it's a human universal to acquire language. And language, therefore, offers an extraordinary window into cognition. So why should we in fact study words? Well, words are considered the building blocks of language. And linguists may argue about the little bits that form language, such as syllables and phonemes and morphemes. They argue about the reality of these units. However, and about what they are, nobody argues whether a word exists. And thus, words actually bridge the domains of cognitive representations and processes. So we know that a child's first words appear more or less around the age of 12 months. That is followed by a two-word stage, around the age of 2. And by the age of 6, language acquisition is largely complete. Now, an adult or an adult native speaker of a language will have a vocabulary of around 40,000 words, and then some even suggest that it may be as high as 70 or 75,000 words. And words are connected in a very rich network of sound and meaning. We acquire words throughout adulthood, and this has important consequences for us, that is, for aging. Here you have an example of a semantic network of the word table, and you see that the connections, there are distances between these connections, meaning also that some words are grouped into a closer network, and this is how we could imagine a semantic network for the word table looks like. So to consider now words and aging, an older person will have acquired very many words. And related words, as we just saw with the network, naturally compete with one another. So an elderly person's increase in knowledge and connections can in fact create word access challenges. And this often leads to the misconception, and I underscore the word misconception, that aging is accompanied by vocabulary loss. So if you think of the word apple that a child learns quite early on in life, you can also see that as one into adulthood and later into older age, one acquires many words, different words for the concept apple. So you have Macintosh, Gala, Red, Delicious, and so on. And when you have to access one of these terms, there's a lot of competition between these labels. So how is vocabulary represented in the mind? This brings us to the concept of the mental lexicon. This construct is, in fact, the domain in which we are asking questions. What is the mental lexicon? It can be conceived as the cognitive system that constitutes the capacity for conscious and unconscious lexical activity. And we can say that Canada has been quite prominent in this domain, and in the community of people who are interested in looking at the mental lexicon as a window into cognition. The mental lexicon has served as the meeting ground for linguists, psycholinguists, speech therapists, and neurologists interested in the fundamental nature of our language ability. We know that words exist in the mind-brain, but nobody has yet been able to see one, actually. So we have dealt in metaphors, as we do many times when we try to understand phenomena. So the first metaphor, the traditional metaphor, was of course the metaphor of a dictionary in which words are listed somehow, and in which we have information on a word's pronunciation, meaning, grammatical category, whether it's a noun, an adjective, a verb, and so on. And this evolved into the metaphor of a computer, of course. So we're talking about processes, about using all the terminology used in the computer world to talk about words, and slowly getting into processes rather than a static view of words in a dictionary. And finally, with the advent, of course, of neuroimaging, we're getting into neural networks, into networks. So this is the new way we look at how words are organized in the mind-brain. And the goal of current research in the field is to refine our way of thinking about words in the mind and brain through wide-range empirical investigations. This is precisely the goal of the newest Words in the World project. I will just mention a few words about the project. So this project is a partnered research training initiative funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Its overall goal is to advance the development of the next generation of research leaders through partnered training and collaborative knowledge creation and mobilization. But here are the sub-goals, and those are the interesting ones. It is to develop psycholinguistic methods with real-world permeability, and the key word here is real-world. So bringing research out of the lab and into the world. The second sub-goal is to understand real-world determinants of processing. So, for instance, changes over the lifespan that are of particular interest to researchers of this research center. Also, the effects of situational contexts in everyday communication. And, of course, a person's own language experience is central, absolutely central. And the final sub-goal is to build innovation and real-world language solutions. So developing new software for research, developing online games and tools to not only to assess, but also to improve lexical performance, and developing new open access and licensed data sources. This just gives you an overview of the research groups working within the Words in the World project. As you can see, apart from the 6 Canadian applicant institutions, there are in fact 54 Canadian and international collaborators over several continents, and 39 academic and sectoral partners. This is just a list of current Canadian and international collaborators in Canada, in Europe, in the Middle East and Asia, and in the US. And importantly, these are our partners, university partners, research organizations, and you will see that the Institut Universitaire de Gériatrie is a partner. And we're very proud that it is so, and very honored. And the industry and the community partners as well, of which many are here in Montreal, situated here in Montreal as well. This gives you a general sense of the organization of this project, in a sense that we have a common vision. Synergy is extremely important. We have the involvement of researchers, but importantly clinicians and the community and the industry, private, public sectors, in order to, of course, have action plans and best practice models and develop activities and eventually, of course, as well monitor our work. Now, the expertise within the partnership includes the expertise in very many languages, many methods, behavioral, neurobehavioral, computational, and so forth, and importantly, groups. So it is about the lifespan, a full range of ages from toddlers all the way to the older adult, and also including multilingualism, from monolinguals to bilinguals to multilinguals and to language learners as well. So there's the acquisition aspect as well. Literacy, adult illiterate populations, endangered languages, and of course challenges, so people who suffer from aphasia, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, MCI, autism, depression, anxiety, dyslexia, and so on. And here is simply a slide showing you the 6 universities involved in Canada. And at this point, I'm going to be inviting Dr. Gary Libben to talk to you more about words and the processing of words, Dr. Gary Libben is professor and chair at the Department of Applied Linguistics at Brock University, where until recently he served as Vice President Research. Dr. Libben is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and he's an international renowned expert in the domain of word processing and is director, in fact, of the Words in the World project. And finally, I must also underscore that he's a membre associé of our research institute. Gary?
Bonjour, c'est un grand plaisir pour moi d'être ici aujourd'hui. Words of extraordinary power. Just before we started, Yves Joannette came up to me and said, "Welcome home." 2 words makes all the difference in the world. And I feel like I'm at home. And so I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate everyone and all of us who are taking part in this celebration of truly an extraordinary achievement that's not only a building, not only a center, it is really a home to which people feel they want to come back to, and to which people feel they belong. So I'm very much honored. I would like to come back to the metaphor slide that Gonia Jarema put up in her presentation, and that had to do with the metaphors for words in the brain, starting from a dictionary, going to that brain-like thing on your right-hand side. And if I could now attach some words to that transition and what it might mean, and maybe it's about thinking about words in the mind from a previous view, which had words in the mental lexicon as a repository, now thinking about it as a network. From thinking about the mental lexicon as static to now thinking about it as dynamic. And, well, maybe just from, nicely organized to untitledly beautiful. And in many ways, going from organized to untitledly beautiful is maybe thinking about going from a 19th century perspective on the mental lexicon to a 21st century perspective. And you might wonder, well, that's very nice, but how would you know this? What kind of evidence would be related to this? And I'd like to maybe demonstrate this with an experiment that doesn't require any fantastic equipment at all. So we're going to see in just a little while experiments that require really, really cool technology. But this one doesn't require any technology at all. And as a matter of fact, you could participate in the experiment quite easily. So if you're sitting on, so you got 2 arrows. If you're sitting on one side of the room, you're going to see a word. And if you sit on one side of the room, the one with the arrow going that way, your task is to try to understand as quickly as possible the word that you're going to see. If you're sitting on the other side of the room, you have a different task. Your task would be to use all of your energy to not understand the word. Okay? It's going to appear pretty slowly. You ready? Or maybe it's not going to appear at all.
Yes.
There we go. Good? Good. Okay, here's the moral of the story. Didn't make a difference what side of the room you're on. By the way, was anyone on this side successful in not understanding the word? Highly unlikely. And as a matter of fact, now if we had millisecond timers attached to all of you, you would find that everyone behaves pretty much the same way. And that's that disorganized, beautiful thing, because it doesn't matter what you try to do, because you can't make those connections are not under strategic control. You cannot make them. Willing them to happen quickly will not have any difference. Willing them to not happen at all will also not make any difference. I've got one more. Would you try this one? Ready? Okay? Now, this is about the massive connectivity. If you are French-English bilingual, you did not see the English word chat. You saw the French word chat. And if you were an English speaker who just happened to speak French, you might have thought that you saw the English word chat, but if we had a millisecond timer attached to it, you would have been slower, not faster, slower, because the previous word was dog. And so you couldn't turn off that previous word. You couldn't stop yourself from understanding it. Neither could you stop yourself from retaining it. So you know what of course the research suggests, and your little demonstration suggests, is that you've got a very untidy, very big network of words that contain items from many, many languages. You can choose to not speak a language, but you can't choose to not understand it. So the moral of the story here would be, maybe tell us something about our natures. You know, why are we this way? Because what we really want is to we want as much meaning in our lives as possible, and somehow our minds are organized and perhaps just develop to maximize that opportunity for meaning creation. Clearly, you saw through the demonstration, these words are not things. They're activities that you engaged in that you could not stop yourself from engaging in. And I think quite importantly, words can be better. So by demonstrating your extraordinary lexical ability, you were actually slower at everything, not faster, worse, but actually better. And in many ways, this is a very new perspective, but it turns out, nothing's really new. And I'd like to, if I may, just draw on one intellectual precursor, thinking about words in the mind, and that is William James, certainly an intellectual giant by any counting and by any account. He was an American psychologist. Quite an extraordinary person. Came from a family of accomplished intellectuals, and there's a quote I think that's very relevant to how we might think about words in the mind, and it was a quote from him about the nature of consciousness, and trying to capture an idea or a thought or a word may be like trying to examine the structure of a snowflake by holding it in your warm hand, or by turning the light on and off very quickly just to see how the darkness might look. But of course we know that neither of those activities are going to be tremendously fruitful. And maybe thinking about a word as a thing is like trying to hold a warm snowflake, a snowflake in your warm hand, that you're just going to ruin it by trying to hold it still, because that's not what you should be doing. Now, what about the worse is better part? I think this has extraordinary implications all around, but especially for processing across the lifespan, and in particular in later years. As Gonia mentioned, one of the things that's going to happen as you get older is you're going to know, if things go well, you're going to know more words, many, many more words. They're going to bump into each other. It's going to make you slower, but it's going to make you better. And that's demonstrated by your activity, just in an experiment that we did together, where you were slower, but shows how you're better. There are many more examples of this. I think we're going to see in the upcoming talks examples that involve intraday potentials, are an extraordinary technology that is both supple and revealing. I'd like to demonstrate just one that's maybe a little different, showing again how you cannot do it. You cannot stop yourself from doing anything. So this is not. This is eye tracking. This is someone just reading a sentence like this with their eyes being tracked. the key word is the English word manger in there. So it's a, it's a good Christmas-themed example. So of course, if these are French-English bilingual, so the English word is manger, but of course you're going to see manger in there. And if you look at people do these things, are they going to stop over here? Are they going to bounce around? They're going to come back. And they're going to think, I just looked at the sentence. That's the amazing thing. They're going to think, I just looked at the sentence. But they were worse, they were slower, but of course they were better. If you don't know anything, you're not coming back to that word. But it's a demonstration of your ability. And here's one final example. This is from an experiment that Gonia and I are doing. This is people writing words. And this is, these are French and English examples. You'll see them, if you're reading them in French, they look like French words. And if you're reading them in English, they look like English words. In fact, they're the exact same words. So we chose words that are typed, so no accent aigu, no accent grave, no silent letters. They're exactly the same words. And so the English experiment, people are doing the experiment in English. The French are doing it in French, entirely different populations, different testing sites, different computers, the exact same, pretty much the exact same pattern of results. People see little pieces in these words. It makes them slower. You can see that those spikes are slower response latencies. But if they didn't really understand the words, they wouldn't be slower. And they would be, in fact, not as good. The goal of thus the goal of the research is to use this is to use this research to produce better, more meaningful analyses of lexical ability, to understand how the increase in lexical knowledge and connectivity can be used as an advantage. Even though it makes you slower, it's still an advantage. And perhaps to develop new ameliorative techniques to make us not faster, but better in the long run by using this kind of research as a framework. To achieve these goals, you need lots of people involved working together, and that would bring me back to Gonia's slide. And I have the pleasure, of course, working with a lot of fantastic colleagues, two of whom you'll hear from in just a little while. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Gary, for giving us the big picture. Our next speaker is our invited guest, Dr. Ruth Ann Atchley. She's a professor of psychology and assistant vice chancellor at the University of Kansas. Her nearly 20 years of research at Kansas University combines neuroscience data with research on individual differences in emotional, linguistic, and other cognitive processes. She investigated how the cerebral hemisphere contribute to the problems of language comprehension observed in readers with a history of developmental language disorder, and sought to develop measures of the perceptual and neurological processing abilities of adults with Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Atchley is also investigating negative bias seen in depressed individuals and those with chronic pain disorders to help predict depression risk and relapse. More recently, Dr. Atchley's research includes a greater emphasis on the positive side of psychology. An example of this is a project utilizing behavioral, functional imaging, and neurophysiological research tools to better understand a person's willingness to behave generously. Another example is a project that looks at questions of how creativity and emotion processing can be facilitated by increased exposure to natural settings and increased involvement with attention-demanding modern technology. Ruth Ann.
Thank you. Thank you so very much for inviting me to participate in this excellent event. It's ironic, listening to Gary and Gonia talk about the history of words in the world, you might have sort of picked up on the introduction, the lovely introduction that Gonia gave me. I feel like the Mental Lexicon group has been really helpful in following along with my own research career, in that I was part of the original Words in the Mind, and then the Words in the Brain project, and now Words in the World. And, excuse me. And there's a lot of parallel. Let me borrow that. There you go. There's a lot of parallel between where my research program has gone. I started as a basic psycholinguist in my graduate training. Then I moved to doing neuroscience at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And then during my time at the University of Kansas, through collaboration with clinicians and with economists and with folks in linguistics and sociology and many other disciplines, have started asking a lot of questions about how words and language processing happens in the real world. So, you know, it's ironic and fabulous that I've been able to stay with the same fabulous group of people and continue to engage in research, and there's a lot of parallels in where we've gone, both as a larger body of researchers across the world, but also where my own research has led me. Now, today I'm actually going to do a little bit of more of a primer, quite honestly, and I apologize in advance if you sort of think I'm throwing a laundry list of information at you. That is kind of by intent. But the reason for that is that, one, I want to talk a little bit more about linguistic processing. I'm going to go beyond words in this talk, and I'm going to bravely go into the land of phonology and phoneme processing and orthography. I'm also going to go beyond the level of words and talk about syntax and how things happen in groups of words or sentences. And the idea is that I'm going to do that in conjunction with trying to provide you with, in a way, a sales pitch that we can go back to a tool that I have used in a large part of my career, electrophysiology, and use the tools of electrophysiology in what I hope to argue is a very cost-effective and utilitarian way to understand both these complex linguistic processes, but how these linguistic processes change with pathologies like dementia. So, and this is fabulous. It's like we coordinated things. We beautifully fit together. Here is sort of just one of dozens of versions of a kind of staged representation of language processing that I could share. And the idea is that when we are processing language, there's really no way of getting away from the fact that there's multiple steps that you have to go through, both in the comprehension side and when you're producing language. And so one of the complexities as a cognitive psychologist, a neurolinguist, or a neuropsychologist is that it'd be nice to be able to sort of examine exactly which parts of the larger language process are affected by some pathological language experience. Now, there's lots of great ways of doing this using neuroscience, and I'm giving a nod out here to our colleague from University of McGill. And given that I am plugging his book, I hope he will forgive me if he's here or hears about this talk, because I know I will massacre his name, because I had no idea there was a relationship between chat and dog. Okay, so that is how bad my knowledge of French is. So I'm going to try it. Michel Petraitz, something like that. Good-ish? I listened to it over and over again, and I'm awful. But the point is that there are lots of great ways to do neuroscience to look at language. And I really like this review in that Dr. Michael does a nice job of bringing together a number of different kinds of very complex, very sophisticated ways of looking at the functional neuroanatomy of language using comparative models, as we heard yesterday with a lot of the muscle activity work, but also looking at various ways of using magnetic resonance imaging and steady-state connectivity kinds of models to look at how language is processed in the brain. But what I want to offer to you is an alternative kind of technique. I also believe that it provides really excellent direct evidence of how cortical processes are contributing to language processing. And this is through the utilization of electrophysiological techniques. Now, the general utility of EEG, I would argue, is that it does allow us to look at large populations of neurons that are engaged in the complex roles that we need them to be engaged in order for us to be successful in engaging in cognition and language comprehension and language production. It's also, I would argue, relatively cost effective. Now, I do also functional magnetic resonance imaging, but truthfully, a lot of times when we need to be able to directly study the brain, you know, at least for me as an American, there's not so much grant dollars available, and quite honestly, EEG is a lot more cost effective. And it's relatively quick. Really, you can get a lot of very effective data in a relatively short period of time, and I think there's tons of evidence to suggest that it provides a really effective tool for studying things like neurocognitive disorders like Alzheimer's disease. Now, you know, in the vein of full disclosure, there are some downsides to EEG, and these include the fact that there's a real signal-to-noise problem when you're doing electrophysiology. There's issues of sort of the degree to which we can hear deeper cortical structures, and probably for me, and the thing that, you know, makes me nuts day in and day out as an electrophysiologist is there's not a huge amount of complete agreement about what all the components or signals that we look at really mean, okay? But truthfully, that can be said of any science. So, but I think we feel it maybe a little bit more keenly in the world of electrophysiology. But having said that, both strengths and weaknesses of this tool, one nice thing about the tool is that really it can be used in a very rich way. And this may be maybe the most revealing thing I'll talk to you about today, because a lot of folks, when they think about electrophysiological methods, really think of it as EEG equals ERP, evoked potentials. And this is not at all true, and our colleagues that are part of the Words in the World grant and who are contributors to the Mental Lexicon projects over the years have been doing a number of very sophisticated kinds of ways of utilizing electrophysiology data. And so here's a nice overview, and actually I'm providing a very recent reference, so if you're jotting down quickly, they do an excellent job of discussing all the tools, ways one can use EEG data. But I'm going to focus on ERPs. This is sort of my bread and butter work. And again, I think it's nice in that it has a particular kind of utility and that it allows us to look at those different stages of language comprehension and production. Now, when we get into the ERPs that are most commonly used for language, first of all, you kind of have to start with my colleague, Madame Federici, but here's a list from a recent article that she published of a place to start, again, in the vein of providing a primer. Here are some of the basic ERP components that one can utilize, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time both discussing these components and how they fall into that long-staged model of language comprehension, but I'm also going to provide you with just some nibbles, some bites of information about how each of these components have been used to study aging or pathological aging and dementia. So, starting at the phonological or orthographic level of language detection, there are a number of components one can use, whether we're talking about auditory language or visual language. The first of these is the N1, or sometimes part of an N1P2 complex, which is a very early ERP component that's thought to be generated in primary auditory cortex and be reflective of early identification of phonemic information. A kind of parallel to that is the N170, originally sort of most associated with the detection of faces, but recent research has shown that, and I think now enough recent research has shown that it also can be, basically, you see this component when you have expertise in processing some kind of complex and complex visual stimulus like faces where you need to have discrimination between a lot of different members of that category. And words happen to be that way, or letters and words happen to be that way. So we definitely see the N170 as a reflection of, say, the distinction between high and low frequency words, for example. And then another one is the mismatch negativity, the MMN, hugely studied component. And it's not the same as an N100. I'm going to just say it. Here I am being firm. It is, but it is also sensitive to orthographic processing. So the stuff you guys care about is how might we use these as a tool for understanding something like Alzheimer's disease or dementia. And there's going to be sort of an overarching theme here. What I'm trying to do is, one, say, yes, some of this work has been done, so you can look to it as a guide for how to do this kind of research yourself. But also what I'm also trying to do with each of these, sort of this review, is let you know that, you know, not all ERP components are created equal. And one of the things that happens, and I'm sure everybody in this room can sort of attest to, is if you're, whether you're studying older adults or you're studying individuals with, say, a dementia, a lot of times it's, you know, for that population, the signal is smaller or slower or harder to see or something like that, right? And one of the things I want to show you is that there is some degree of specificity with regard to these components. And that's the beauty of it, going back to that word that we just used, that's the beauty of it, because it can actually help us distinguish when one of these sub-processes are in fact sustained, either in the older adult or in the patient population, and discriminate that from a sub-process that in fact is impacted by the pathology. So just that level of discrimination that I think we're all kind of hungry for when we're trying to understand a complex process in a pathological population or an older adult population, which those aren't the same. All right, so the issue is, for example, with the N1, this is an example where there is, in fact, typically found a reduction in the N1 amplitude in patients with, for example, in this study, familial history of Alzheimer's disease, okay? And this may, in fact, be an early detector, an early cue that this person is at greater risk for developing the disorder. There's also a decrease, interestingly, in the N170, but there's not, for example, a difference in the MMN, this mismatch negativity between older adults and Alzheimer's disease patients, okay? So that is, to me, very interesting in the sense that it allows for some degree of discrimination, but it also then, as a theorist, as a person who's trying to understand these underlying cognitive processes, it allows me to sort of dig down more deeply and ask questions about, so what really is triggered by the MMN versus the, say, N100. In the processing of syntax, another domain of linguistic processing that's of great interest to many of us, there are also a number of components. I'm giving you a subset of those that have been used. The early left anterior negativity and its sister component, the left anterior negativity, which comes in a bit later, and also one of the most well-studied language components, the P600. And this slide, by the way, is just meant to sort of give you an idea of sort of scalp distribution and sort of some of the stimuli and conditions that generate these different components. All in all, most of these are sensitive to, or all of these are sensitive to some aspect of syntactic violation or incongruity, and I could go into way too much detail as to what differentiates between the ELM versus P600. That's not the nature of this talk. But again, I'm just sort of trying to provide you with some guideposts to what kinds of components you can look at if you were interested in studying syntax in various populations. Now, coming back to this idea of the evidence with regard to the impact on Alzheimer's disease as one patient population. And in fact, I'm going to talk here more about Parkinson's disease because interestingly, for the two components of the left anterior negativity, either the early one that comes in around 200 milliseconds or the later one that comes in closer to about 400 milliseconds after the syntactic violation, what we find is that there's actually not much work, at least published that I could find, and I dug and dug and dug, that has been done looking at Alzheimer's disease. But there is work by Federici and colleagues, for example, that have looked at Parkinson's disease and these components. And again, here we get an example of the Parkinson's disease patients don't really differ on the ELAN between themselves and age-max controls. So arguing, at least what Federici would argue for, sort of sustained early syntactic categorization and building of the original structure of the sentence. However, later, the P600, which is meant to reflect possibly reanalysis of the overarching syntactic or sentential structure of the sentence, is in fact affected and is in fact later and smaller, reduced in amplitude in individuals with Parkinson's disease. And in fact, Lichny, again, bad pronunciation of names, forgive me, I just haven't met these folks, has argued that the P600 in particular may be a very effective biomarker for the development of Alzheimer's disease. So he's done work discriminating Alzheimer's, he and his colleagues have done work discriminating folks with that are just brought in and watched in a longitudinal study and have no evidence of MCI or early Alzheimer's, and a portion of his sample went on to develop Alzheimer's disease, and that group had an abnormal P600 prior to any cognitive symptoms being obvious in that group. And same is true, that was the later study, that's the 2013 work. The 2008 work, he was looking at folks with very early markers of Alzheimer's, and those folks that really progressed into full-blown disease had the diminished P600. So here's, sort of that holy grail I know we're all looking for, which is early biomarkers for the onset of disease. Now, in the semantic domain, or studying the meanings of words, kind of more in keeping with what Gonia and Gary were talking about in much of their work, or their introduction, I should say, there are a number of components we can use to look at semantic processing. The best known is definitely the N400. Marta Kudis and her colleagues and others have gone after sort of really trying to dig down deep on understanding this particular component. It's one of the most highly published components we have. And it really does seem to sort of focus on or be sensitive to lexical semantic integration. And you can see this sort of laundry list of different kinds of things that seem to cause a change in the amplitude or the latency of the N400, and everything from word frequency to also some things that are more syntactic in nature. Again, that idea of lexical and lexical integration, as was reviewed, and larger semantic context in the level of discourse. I would also argue that the P300, though most commonly associated with attention and memory processing, also can be a really useful tool for studying semantic processing, because the P300, probably the most famous ERP component there is, maybe infamous is a good word too. The P300 is, though not specific to language, it is very sensitive to the creation of different categories of various types. So it can be a simple kind of categorization like dissociating basic auditory distinctions like beeps versus boops. But it can also be used to discriminate very complex sort of semantic categories like animacy or, we've looked at things like a lot of time we spend time looking at differences between positive and negative words in folks with depression. And we can not only see differences in categorization of positive versus negative, but person-referent positive versus non-person referent positive. So the difference between beautiful and gift, for example, can be used. That discrimination can be seen in sort of differences in categorization that are reflected in the amplitude of the P300. So Nancy's going to talk a little bit more about what we've done with the P300, but the idea is that this can also be used to study semantics. So what do we find? So for the N400, there has been a fair bit of research that's been done with patients with dementia. In particular, again, in this review, I was just focusing on Alzheimer's disease. And we know that in semantic priming studies, for example, we get a diminished or smaller N400 amplitude and elongated latency, so the onset of the component is delayed in patients with both mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. And the idea is that this may be a breakdown in the organization of semantic memory. So as we were discussing earlier, there is certainly, as the our semantic memory system or our mental lexicon system grows with size and age, in size with age, but one of the things that might become affected with these dementias is that the sort of organization and ability to access that complex vocabulary becomes both slowed and less precise. Now, having said that, again, this is not, as with any area of science, there's not always the same findings. So Ford and colleagues, for example, could not see a change in the N400. And so I'm not saying that that means that I don't believe that there's quite a large body of research suggesting N400 changes with Alzheimer's disease. What's interesting to me is to dig down and say, okay, if we consistently find this dissociation in these findings, now I can get into some subtle studies of the differences in the intricacies of how the mental lexicon might be organized. So you can see how I'm sort of turning lemons into lemonade, but the bottom line is I think there's a lot that can be done and should be done utilizing these tools, because I think that they can give us some very fine discrimination ability. So for the P3, there's also been a fair bit of work. This is one of the larger pieces. And we do know that both the P3 amplitude and latencies are smaller and slower in Alzheimer's disease patients, and there's quite a lot of research in that domain. And in fact, again, kind of going back to what we were talking about, I think the P3 amplitude might in fact be, like the P600, one of those sort of biomarkers that might give us some earlier sensitivity or earlier ability to detect sort of the presence of what will ultimately become the more profound disease state. So, but having said that, there's not a huge amount of this work with the P300 that's been using language-oriented stimuli. Again, the P300 has been studied quite a lot and has been used to study attention and memory and lots of different kinds of stimuli, and I think there's a lot of room for good work to happen using language-oriented stimuli with the P300. So just to conclude, what I hope I've convinced you of is that EEG generally and ERPs more specifically are a really useful tool for studying, potential tool for studying dementia. It's really, I think, exciting to think about all the ways that we could use these different components that are sensitive to different stages within the time course of language processing to pull apart and disambiguate exactly where in that larger process of language comprehension we're seeing specific breakdown in folks with pathologies like Alzheimer's disease. And but please, if you're at all interested, contact me. Let's talk, because there is, as Gonia indicated, I'm also assistant vice chancellor. Truthfully, I'm mostly an administrator anymore. There you go, if I'm being honest. But I think this is a really important area of research. I think there's a lot that we could be doing using EEG. It's cost effective and so forth. And I really do think that there could be so much more rich work done using ERPs to study language processing in older adults, healthy older adults, as well as those who have dementia. Thank you very much for your attention. Do we have time for questions, or are we going to move on? Oh, okay. Excellent.
Thank you very, very much, Ruth Ann, for this beautiful and very inspiring talk. I forgot to mention that I was keeping questions for the end of our session. No, but we do have time, so I think it would be nice to have questions for Ruth Ann at this point in time. Donc, vous pouvez poser des questions.
But only in English, please.
Or in French.
You can translate. True enough.
Est-ce qu'il y a des questions? Voilà, ça va mieux comme ça.
It was just that good.
Alors, non. Alors, encore une fois, merci.
Thank you.
So our final speaker for this session is Dr. Nancy Azevedo, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Montreal and le Centre de Recherche de l'Institut Universitaire de Gériatrie de Montréal under my mentorship. And she's also under the mentorship of Dr. Eva Kehaya, who is here today, and therefore at McGill and at CRIR as well. Nancy will follow up very nicely on Ruth Ann's talk and give us talk to us about her work using ERP, the ERP methodology to study Alzheimer's disease. Nancy?
Thank you very much for your introduction. I just want to begin by acknowledging my collaborators for this research today. Ruth Ann talked very broadly about different aspects of language that we're interested in, but today specifically what I'd like to talk to you about is visual word recognition. So this is the process that allows us to recognize a word. So it allows a person to read, to recognize, to pronounce, and also to extract the meaning from a written stimulus string. And most importantly for our talk today, it allows a reader to determine whether a string of letters that they see is in fact a word or not in their language, or as we call it, to make a lexicality judgment. And as psycholinguists, we like to distinguish between two types of word-like stimuli, and this will be important for our results later. So we differentiate between pseudo-words that are both orthographically and phonologically legal strings of letters, but that don't carry any meaning. And we contrast these with non-words that are not legal, so not orthographically, phonologically legal. They're not pronounceable, and they also don't carry meaning. But before I talk to you about our study, I just want to talk very briefly about Alzheimer's disease. So currently in Canada, over 500,000 people are living with a form of dementia, and well over half of cases of dementia are accounted for by Alzheimer's disease. So it's a very important problem that we're facing, but I don't need to convince you of that. And we know that Alzheimer's disease is in fact primarily characterized by deficits in episodic and learning memory, but we know also that even early on in the course of the disease, language is affected in Alzheimer's disease. So coming back to lexicality judgments and word recognition, the literature shows that people with Alzheimer's disease are consistently slower in making a lexical decision than older adults. And what's interesting is they also appear to show a decrease in accuracy when being asked to make these decisions, but not in all stimuli types. So what we see is that they have a particular difficulty in rejecting pseudo-words, but not in accepting words. So this to us suggests that it is possible that making lexicality judgments can in fact be vulnerable to disruption by the AD process, but importantly, this might only become evident when we include pseudo-words as part of the evaluation. So we know that having a more comprehensive understanding of the underlying linguistic abilities and limitations in early AD is important, and these can help provide a clearer picture of the cognitive changes that occur with the disease. And also it complements what we already know in other domains, such as memory and other areas of cognition. So overall, what we were interested in is investigating and describing potential changes that occur in the ability to make lexical decision tasks or lexicality judgments in healthy aging as well as in individuals with Alzheimer's disease. And we used using electrophysiological methodologies. So for the experiment, Ruth Ann gave us a beautiful overview of ERPs, so I just have a very brief explanation, but I will tell you a little bit more about the oddball paradigm that Ruth Ann talked about that elicits the P3 component. So what we know is that when participants are presented with two types of stimuli in a random order, but with one occurring more often than the other, typically 80% of the time, we see a P3 component to the rare stimulus type. Let me get my pointer. So for example, if we see many frequent squares and rare circles, if the participants are able to differentiate and create categories that differentiate these two stimuli types, we expect to see a P3. So that's exactly what we see here. So the key thing here is that we need to be able to identify that there's a difference between the two stimuli types. If we are able to create these categories, then we should see a P3 component elicited to the rare trials, in this case, the circles. So we know that a reduction in P3 amplitude could be indicative of a change in a participant's ability to effectively create categories that can distinguish between the stimuli types. So what we wanted to know is, can we use P3 amplitude as a metric of the ability to use lexicality as a salient feature when performing lexicality judgment tasks? So in order to do this, we created a lexical decision oddball task. So instead of using circles and squares or various other types of stimuli, we used linguistic stimuli, words or word-like stimuli. And the participants in our experiment were 17 healthy older adults and 10 individuals with Alzheimer's disease. And all of our participants had a minimum 7 years of education. They were dominant English speakers who had no history of dyslexia. And because it's a visual task, they had normal or corrected to normal vision. Specifically for the healthy older adults, we administered the MOCA test, and only participants who scored 26 or above were included in the study, so that indicates that they had a normal level of cognition. For the individuals with Alzheimer's disease, we used the mini mental state examination, and we included participants who scored 20 or above, indicating that they were in the mild severity range. So each participant saw 4 blocks of our lexical decision oddball task. They were presented in a counterbalanced order, and each of the tasks, each of the blocks, I should say, followed the same pattern. So participants saw a stimulus, either a word and a non-word, or a word or a pseudo-word, for 750 milliseconds. Then they saw a blank screen, and 1500 milliseconds after, they saw a question mark, and that indicated that they could make their response. And they were asked to respond yes if the stimulus they had seen was a word, or respond no if the stimulus wasn't a word. For our P3 ERP analysis, we compared 40 rare trials to 40 frequent trials, and we calculated the mean amplitude in the 500 to 650 millisecond time window at the PZ electrode. So what did we find? Well, happily for us, we found, in fact, a P3 for the rare trials, and we saw this in both of our participant groups, so that was very happy. We saw the critical P3 effect in both groups. However, what we saw is that although both of the groups did show a P3, they didn't, so although we did see this, not every single block elicited a P3 component. And more interestingly still, is that the pattern of P3 responses to the various blocks was different between the two groups. So specifically, starting with the older adults, we saw a P3 component, so the top two graphs, we saw a P3 component in the trials that were comparing words and non-words. So where a lexical judgment could be made based on orthographic legality or a mismatch in orthographic legality between the stimuli. And that this suggests that the participants were able to create categories that could differentiate between the legal and the illegal stimuli types. However, for the two blocks that looked at words and pseudo-words where both stimuli types are in fact legal, we no longer observed a P3, and this indicates that they weren't able to create effective categories that could differentiate between the two legal types of stimuli. When we look at the individuals with Alzheimer's disease, we see a very different pattern of results. So what we see here is a P3 component only in the two blocks that had frequent words. So that suggested that yes, they were able to create categories that differentiated, but only when words were the frequent stimulus type. And when we look at the two at the bottom that compare words and pseudo-words or words and non-words, so words and not a word category, we no longer observed a P3 when the non-word stimuli were the frequent condition. So for healthy older adults, we believe that being the P3 response between the blocks was in fact mediated by the individual's sensitivity to the orthographic and phonological legality of the stimuli. However, we saw that task expectancy, whether the frequent trials were words or not words, didn't seem to affect their ability to perform the test and to elicit a P3. In contrast, for the individuals with Alzheimer's, it appears that their P3 response wasn't at all related to orthographic phonological legality, but instead that task expectancy, whether words were the frequent category, does seem to influence whether they were able to create word and not a word categories. So overall, we believe that this insensitivity to orthographic and phonological, to orthography and phonology in the Alzheimer's population can in fact be contributing to the slowing that I talked about earlier in the talk, in their slowing in the ability to make lexical decisions. So what's interesting here is that this suggests that there is in fact a language-related deficit that becomes apparent early on in AD that's really contributing over any general slowing that's associated with disease to our slowing that we observe in the response times and making a lexicality decision. So we believe that there is in fact a language-related deficit that's contributing to the slowing of response times when making lexical decision tasks. So overall, to conclude, alterations in P3, as we observed for the individuals with Alzheimer's, when we combine them with other linguistic markers, other cognitive markers, can be very helpful, we believe, in identifying early differences between healthy aging and early dementia. And we know that this is very important because it can help contribute to an earlier diagnosis of the disease. And we aim to have an early diagnosis of the disease and an accurate diagnosis of the disease because it allows many factors, including the patient's ability to benefit from early treatment options, including pharmacological ones, but also to help involve them in the planning and decision making for their future care. And finally, because we do find that there are language-specific changes that occur with Alzheimer's, having a better understanding of these differences can be very informative for speech-language pathologists and help guiding their language therapy options. Because what we really want to do is to capitalize on the abilities that are preserved and then target the ones that are more susceptible to impairment with a disease. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nancy. We have quite a bit of time for questions. Sylvie?
I have two questions. One first to Nancy.
Oh, yes.
So, I was wondering whether how you expect these to be sensitive to the very early stage. For instance, do you know anything about what happens with this kind of tax person with MCI? Because you know, perhaps in CIMAQ, the Consortium for Early Identification of Alzheimer's Disease, we actually have a broad range of tests. And we were quite surprised by the fact that the language tests were sensitive, in fact, and that there were some things happening even prior to the dementia phase.
Yes.
The dementia phase, you would expect language to come into the dance, but
so that's actually one of the next steps we want to look at. When we were approaching how to begin this, we started with behavioral tasks that were done pen and pencil, and these are much less sensitive. And what we saw in our lexical decision task, looking at these three types of stimuli, words, non-words, pseudo-words, is that there was no real difference other than a little bit of slowing between participants who had MCI, participants who had healthy aging and participants with Alzheimer's disease. Based on those behavioral results, and because this was part of my PhD research and to be more time effective, we decided that we would start looking at whether there was a difference between healthy aging and Alzheimer's disease. If we did see it, then we wanted to come look at the in-between stage. That would be ideal. If we already start to see these differences in individuals with MCI, that would be very, very interesting. And now we have reason to look there. When we looked just at the end result, yes or no, there was nothing indicating that there was a difference, except they were slightly slower, but we expected them to be slightly slower. This is showing us that there seems to be something linguistically based that's driving this slowing down, that's not just general, but is associated with language. So next step, yes, we want to look at, to replicate this with participants with MCI and see where it goes.
And did you start the discussion of the whole?
Yes, we can open the discussion, of course.
Yeah, I had a question for Gary or perhaps for you, Gonia. It's because particularly Gary's demonstration made me think of this notion of this idea of linkage, perhaps because people with older adults they're known to have inhibition deficits, and her view is that inhibition deficits are sometimes could be detrimental, but at some other occasions it can be a plus, because if you have an inhibition deficit, it means that, for instance, when you read, the related words might be better activated, and then when you need to activate them on some further occasions, then they would be more readily available, if you wish. So the problem would become a strength. So I was wondering whether you integrated that in your vision of bilingualism as sometimes being a problem, because you activate a number of candidates that can be make you slow down, but in fact reflects the fact that you have a broader understanding. So how would that relate to your hypothesis model?
Yes, I would say exactly what you said, because that's exactly the way the way I see it, and I believe many others do as well. The massive connectivity. Well, actually, let me just answer the first part. Exactly as you stated, it's if you are a multilingual, you are going to know many more words. You cannot partition them, so they are going to bump into each other. that will and that will require some at least attempted inhibition, and that's probably post-access attempted inhibition. That's going to make you slower, but it's also going to make you richer. So you'll have a much larger web of associations, which and your linguistic world, even in the millisecond domain, is going to be richer and better. And if I may, I think that's very much related to the non-word effect. That basically, if you think about illegal non-words, that's the quick apperception that, oh, that could never be. But you think about, say, my situation as a second language speaker of French here in this room. If I were to receive a question in French and there were a word that I would not understand, I would never think that's impossible. I would think it's a word I've never heard before. And that, of course, makes that changes your relationship to your linguistic world, slower but richer.
See, if you are older and you have an inhibition processes, then that imposes a further level of complexity, though.
Indeed.
Because these will be more activated, so that will be helpful in some occasions, but detrimental in other occasions, relative to younger ones, of course.
Exactly correct. Thank you.
Quick question for Ruth Ann.
Yes.
I can call you Ruth Ann.
Please, of course.
Because I don't know how to pronounce your last name.
Well, that's okay. That's helpful because now I feel much less guilty about what I was saying earlier. So thank you. That's a gift.
My pleasure. Well, I was wondering if you know any work that has been done on ERP studies on complex mental representations such as scripts. Because I've been very interested in scripts. I'm an occupational therapist, so I'm looking at complex representation of knowledge and activities of daily living. And we've been seeing that those scripts tend to decrease with aging,
right.
But more specifically in Alzheimer's disease and MCI. So I was wondering if you know any work that has been looking at the degradation of those scripts from a maybe linguistic or language perspective, and maybe we could see relationships with behavior problems in activities of individuals.
That's an excellent question, and so there are a range of ERP components that have been used with various kinds of memory processes, but I'm trying to retrieve anything that's been used directly on sort of schema and script kinds of knowledge, and I'm not retrieving it right this second. So in part, this is probably a reflection of the fact that I'm more of a psycholinguist than a memory researcher. But I will just riff off your question a little bit and use it as a sort of springboard to talk about ERPs. What I find sort of most exciting about doing ERP research is that, like with the P300, people really hadn't used the P300 to study lexicality very much. There was maybe one or two other studies that have been done. And one of the things that's kind of fun is it's a domain to be very creative. So one of the tricks to sort of thinking about, say, if I'm interested in the nature of degradation of scripts, how could I be looking at a component we know very well and sort of find a way to creatively utilize that component to get at sort of what you care about. So just to sort of engage in that sort of creative activity right this second in front of all of you, one thought, and it's kind of consistent with what you're talking about, is we were interested in self-representation in individuals with depression. Not exactly the same thing, but in a way you can almost think of self-representation as a kind of script. It's sort of the script of me, right? And who I am. So again, stretching a smidge, but something I can actually speak to. And what we did, which I thought was very creative, was we used our good old friend the N400, and we utilized sentences like, I consider myself to be a winner versus loser versus Canadian, okay, which presumably, at least for Americans right now, used to be a pretty neutral thing. I don't know what that is right now, so I wouldn't want to do that. But anyways, different issue altogether. But the point is that what we found was that the N400 was in fact sensitive to the integration of that word into the larger schema of who am I, So for example, with a person with depression, if you say, I consider myself to be a winner, you get a big N400. It looks a lot like I consider myself to be a wagon. And if you are currently in a state of depression, or if you've had a past history of depression, I consider myself to be a loser, gives you almost no N400 at all, which is quite sad if you think about it. So the bottom line is that the fun thing about ERPs is that there's room to sort of think about how to take this tool and make it appropriate for the question that you have. Now, what you can't do, and not unless you have a whole lot of time and a whole lot of money and a whole lot of good friends who also want to help you with the process, what I don't recommend is to try to find the script component in the ERP signal. You know, some people are quite honestly both lucky and exceptionally good scientists. Who knows which of those is the first one? And they, you know, become associated with the development of a new component. But what I don't recommend to folks is to try to come in and sort of look at all of the ups and downs that happen in electrophysiological components and sort of say, I think this one is the script component, right? And I'm just saying that as a cautionary tale because sometimes folks try to, like, as my former postdoc PI used to say, Mane Danchin, he said, people try to like read it like it's a script of itself, and that's a mistake. There's no, you know, dog component in the brain, and there's probably not a script. There may be a script-related component, but I'm too old to go find it. So, but what I try to do is I do think there's a lot of utility in being able to take the components we know a fair bit about, or at least this is my strategy. Let me just put it that way. This is my approach. I like taking components we know a fair bit about. We know where it is on the head. We know when it shows up. We know what kinds of conditions should create it. And then find creative ways of using that component to answer a question that we care about. So I think this is fun, and I would love to help if you want to talk. And I think there's definitely ways of using things like the M400, or depending on if you have emotion, something like the LPP or whatever, to get at it. But it can be done.
Thank you. Yes, we have time for another question.
I don't know my question for it's more of it's for everybody.
Good.
So you need to know that I'm an audiologist, so I think in terms of how we process sounds. And it's always interesting to me when you think about processing sound or processing speech beyond the cochlea. We call it an auditory processing disorder. Speech-language pathologists will call it a language disorder, and cognition people will call it a cognitive impairment of some kind.
Yeah.
And
we all want to claim it.
So my question was looking at ERPs, and Nancy was looking at ERPs in the visual domain, and we could do it in the visual domain. Are there studies, or would it be reasonable to sort of do an ERP study and compare a population on a visual task and an auditory task, so then you could say, oh, it really is an auditory processing task because it's language processing, and we don't see it when it's visually.
Absolutely, and that is absolutely an elegant study. So the question is, can we discriminate something that's really an audiological deficit from a language deficit, something that maybe is happening at the lexical level and the representation of meanings of words or word categories? Absolutely, and that's, I mean, JP, you've nailed exactly what I think the utility is of these kinds of tools. Because we know that, for example, the N1 or the MMN are two components I brought up that are, I mean, the N1, you see an N1 for visual information and for auditory information. But many would argue that the mismatch negativity is specific to auditory. And you can, in fact, look at the scout distribution of the components when you're doing it, especially if you have high density arrays, which we didn't use in Nancy's study, but are absolutely readily available, and there's all kinds of sophisticated analysis techniques to do source localization or to do principal components kinds of analyses to tease apart sort of where the signal is coming from. And so there's lots of ways to dig down deep on, is this really something that is likely a reflection of an auditory deficit? It's sort of some kind of early audiological or sort of very early primary auditory cortex distinction kinds of levels, that sort of superior primary temporal lobe area, versus something that's happening in sort of lexical representation or words. And absolutely, and in fact, that's exactly kind of the theme of what I wanted to say, is that I think ERPs, their particular strength is the ability to dissociate different pieces of the time course of processing. That's what they have to offer. They're not great at all that other stuff about telling you where it's happening in the brain. It can be done, but there are debates about that. But for sure, when in the process, I think that's what we're particularly good at.
So I have to find a good audiology student and send them to Nancy and go and say,
yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Any more questions? Well, thank you very much. I would like to thank Ruth Ann and Gary and Nancy for their participating in this session. And I believe it's time for a coffee break, and bon anniversaire.